Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch presentation. We're glad that you all could join us today. For those of you who are here in the auditorium, we just ask that you please silence your cell phones. And for those of you all on Zoom, please mute your microphone and use the chat for your questions. We'll have a Q&A session, as always, at the end of the lecture. If you all didn't get a chance, be sure to grab one of our new program calendars. You can grab those at the front desk. Covers everything going through the end of the year. We got a lot of great programs scheduled for y'all. The next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, September 24th at noon, so that's in 3 weeks. That's featuring Courtney Dwy. She is a member of the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. She will share the story of her grandmother, Judith Klein, who left Germany on the Kindertransport in December 1938, just after Kristallnacht. Judith's father, grandmother, 2 aunts, and 2 of her siblings died in concentration camps. The presentation will explore Judith's experiences as a teenage refugee and her extended family's experiences across Europe during the war. So we hope that y'all will join us for her very moving presentation on September 24th. We also have a schedule change to make note of regarding the program calendar. Unfortunately, we had a water leak over the holiday weekend that flooded our upcoming exhibit, Discover Colonial Life, that was going to open upstairs on the 2nd floor. That also flooded the museum shop, which is why y'all notice that is closed today. So the exhibit opening and the public program that was scheduled for September 27th in here, that is postponed until further notice. And we will keep you all updated as soon as we get a new opening date for that. Now, today we welcome local historians Bill and Chris Barber. They are going to explore how Tyrrell County's hero of the American Revolution, Colonel Edward Buncombe, became American by choice. They're going to focus on the final 10 years of his very remarkable life. So please join us in welcoming our guest speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. We certainly appreciate being here today. Chris and I have spent the last several years doing a lot of research into the American Revolution and the colonial period, particularly as how it relates to Eastern North Carolina. So the presentation today is going to be about Colonel Edward Buncombe of Tyrrell County. And we've decided to split this thing in half. She's going to do the first half. I'll do the second half. So I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Bill. He's going to wait in the wings, and then he'll be back in a little bit. But I also thank Noah and all of you for joining us today here in the auditorium and on Zoom. I don't know if you're aware, but this is the beginning of the America 250 commemoration. It's 250 years ago that the war started on April 19th this year. So there are lots of things going on all over, but we are really pleased because I feel like telling the story of Edward Buncombe now is a little bit more meaningful because we can drill back 250 years and imagine what was going on. And so having said that, I do want to ask, first of all, have any of you heard of Edward Buncombe before? A show of hands? A few. Well, you're just like Bill and I were several years ago. Originally, Buncombe was from Tyrrell County. But after his death within a couple of decades in 1799, the western portion of Tyrrell County was separated and became Washington County. As a consequence, the Buncombe land is now in Washington County. So we share the honor of commemorating him with Tyrrell County. But he really was a Tyrrell County man. And long before anybody dreamed that Washington County would be named for the general under whom Edward Buncombe served. So he was surprised when we discovered Edward Buncombe because we lived there and had never heard of him, but we're pleased to share our research and share the program together. And so we're looking at becoming an American. Edward Buncombe was an immigrant. We're going to look at his life, service, and sacrifice. I assume you all can hear me? Thank you. Edward Buncombe was born in St. Kitts, or the island of St. Christopher, in the West Indies in 1742. He was born into a family of some note in the islands. A registrar later described them as people of standing in the islands. They were rather well-to-do, And when his father died in just 5 years after Edward was born, he made a provision in his will that his son would get a proper education in England. I think that's one more clue that they were people of standing. The star at the left, far left, is where he was baptized in that parish, but the star at the right, the red mark, is where the Buncombe land can be found on a 1753 Samuel Baker map of the island. They were sugar planters and merchants. So we know they were people of standing and they made their money from sugar. And we know what that connotes. So that involves some things that we don't like to think about today, but it took a lot of slave labor to do that. But when his father and uncle moved there about 1730, one of his other uncles moved to North Carolina, and he bought a plantation in Tyrrell County in 1732. And this is a map that shows the area. It is today Washington County, and the circle there, the darkest line right through here is Kendrick's Creek. The winding black waters of the creek take you up to the area where Buncombe Hall once stood. It wasn't Buncombe Hall till Edward had it built, because what happened to Joseph is on a return trip to the islands about 1740, he died. He left a widow, a child, no will, and his property heavily mortgaged. It was 1,025 acres. And so we don't know what happened, but for 25 years, something was happening. And suddenly, about 1766, Edward Buncombe, who was the last or the oldest male Buncombe left in the islands, because his father, all of his uncles were deceased. We're not really sure what he was doing there, but he found out that he had succeeded to the property, which is a distinction. He didn't inherit it. So what he did is he sailed over to Tyrrell County. He visited, looked at it, decided he liked it, because he was either going to sell it or move there. Well, since most of his family was already gone, he decided to move here. So while he was visiting, he commissioned somebody to build him a house. And then he returned to St. Kitts. And in 1768, he moved his wife. They had married in 1766 in April. Their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth, for her mother, and packed everything up, and they moved to Tyrrell County. So that's how he came to be in North Carolina. The main thing I'm going to talk about today, before we get to some really serious battles and things, are the 5 golden years that I believe they had while they lived in the area. And you see, Welcome Hall to Buncombe Hall, he was known for his hospitality and his graciousness. And we know that there's not a lot written about Buncombe like there is written about people who served in the war and they're in this battle and that, or they were politicians, and there's all kinds of documents. So we can't find that much, but we can infer things, because in 1773 in April, Josiah Quincy, a Boston lawyer and patriot, he is actually one of the defenders of the British at the Boston Massacre trial. He was traveling through the South trying to take and I get an idea of what the political leanings were. And as he traveled, he started in Charleston, he moved his way north. When he got to New Bern, a judge in New Bern gave him a letter of introduction to Edward Buncombe. And so in early April of 1773, he appears at Buncombe's landing on Kendrick's Creek, because there were not really any great roads. The creek was the road. That was the way you got there. And he visited with him, and then Buncombe wrote another letter to somebody in Edenton. So that is how he traveled, finding out what the temperature of the colony was and what people were thinking about all the troubles they were having with Great Britain. So we know from that, in his memoir, he commented on this: Welcome All to Buncombe Hall was prominently placed on a gate after you stepped off the dock. That's what greeted you. So everybody knew that you would find a good place to visit at Buncombe Hall. So that's one of the things that we know about him. As I mentioned before, he had a wife, Elizabeth, and their first child was also named Elizabeth, born in 1767. Once here, they had 2 more children, Thomas, named for Edward's father, born in 1769, and Hester, named for Edward's mother, born in 1771. And the family lived in a remote area. I'm pretty certain that the area we're talking about, if you've ever been to Roper in Washington County, and you pass through Roper, there was a road to the right. It is called the Crossroad. It was not built till about 1810 or so. During Buncombe's day, there was no road there. But if you drive down that road towards Mackey's, it cuts through the plantation land. And so it was a remote area. There was a mill built there about 1706, so there was a little bit of industry there. But everybody who lived there were basically planters or farmers or whatever. There were no amenities there. So if they wanted to do something, they went to Edenton, just across the Sound. Because what did Edenton have? It had St. Paul's Anglican Church. The Buncombes were Anglicans. Her father and brother were ministers. So that was their home church. So if they wanted to attend, that's where they had to go. They cultivated friendships. There are records that indicate that Edward Buncombe had relationships with Samuel Johnston, a prominent, by relationships, he had dinner with him. They were part of a discussion group, I think, in the early years before the war began. Also, James Iredell was the administrator at Port Roanoke. And we know that people came to Port Roanoke and sometimes went up to Buncombe Landing and picked up lumber and other products from that area. So there were some connections there. That was important. The other thing that we know is that, and they had friendships. I meant to mention them. Cullen and Ann Booth Pollock were also a wealthy family or a wealthy couple who lived in Edenton, and Elizabeth and Edward and Cullen and Ann Booth became friends. That becomes important a little bit later. Buncombe also had civic appointments. Because he was well educated, he was a likely candidate to be colonel of the Tyrrell Militia in 1771. There was a thing called the War of Regulation out in Alamance County. And so all the different area militias were getting ready so they could go to fight that war. Luckily for Buncombe and the men that he helped train, they didn't have to go because the battle ended quickly and they were relieved of that. But he also served as magistrate in 1771 and then also became clerk of court. But tragedy struck in 1773. Remember, I said there were 5 golden years? Elizabeth died. She was 24 years old, just a few days past her birthday when she passed away. And it's unclear. It seems that probably she died in childbirth. If you think about she was having children in every 2 years, that timing fits, and it seems likely that's what happened. But remember, they had joined St. Paul's Church in Edenton. And so as a result, she got a place of honor for her burial. St. Paul's had only opened about 1767, so it was still a new church. And because they had been building it for about 30 years, but it was still a new church. And so if you've ever been to St. Paul's, has anybody been there? Just, okay. The very first grave that you come to or stone that you come to in the main aisle is Elizabeth's grave. And so that's what you're seeing here, lie at the body of Ms. Elizabeth Dawson Buncombe, wife of Colonel E. Buncombe. That's a place of honor. That also suggests that the Buncombes were well-to-do because they would have been supporting the church probably, and that is probably part of their connection to having such a prominent burial space. So if you haven't been to St. Paul's, I encourage you to go. There are other burials there in the church, within the church. But this is interesting to see how they treated some of the deceased. And so what happens when a young couple loses one of the spouses? A lot of times you're going to see that grief doesn't have to take a long time because you had to be practical. If you were a woman with children, you needed somebody to be the father or to be the provider. If you were a man with children, you needed somebody to help with the household and help raise children. But Edward Buncombe didn't have time to do that because just as he was enjoying 5 golden years with his family being reestablished in their new home in North Carolina, there were other things going on. There was an undercurrent of growing troubles from about 1764, 65 to 1774 that were a result of the 7 Years' War, or also known as the French and Indian War, that was fought between 1756 and 1763. And what happened, it cost Britain a lot of money, and they decided they were going to recover the money by starting to tax the colonists. And so there are a series of taxes that are enacted in the colonies. Usually they protested, sometimes they rioted, often the taxes were rescinded. But this was the climate in which Edward and Elizabeth had lived, and everybody else had lived throughout the colonies. This unite or die symbol was actually generated by Ben Franklin back in the 1760s, but it continues to be prominent. They knew then that we're going to have to unite sometime, otherwise we're not going to make it. So it was a premonition of what was to come. So we had a decade of taxes and unrest in the colonies. I know that you all have a listening knowledge already of these things, so I hope this is just a good review for you. The Stamp Act was a tax on anything printed or on paper, documents, newspapers, books, even playing cards. If you were importing those things into one of the ports in the colonies, you had to pay a special tax. Well, they rescinded that eventually after lots of riots and threats. You also know, you've heard this phrase, no taxation without representation. It started back then as well. You remember the Boston Massacre in 1770, but the Tea Act, in my opinion, is the one that was a step too far, because what happened as a result of the Tea Act? The Boston Tea Party. So let's look at the timeline again and say, okay, Elizabeth died in October of 73. The Tea Act became law in May of 1773. The Boston Tea Party was held in December of 1773. So all that was going on, and messages were coming and going by express riders to keep everybody in the colonies informed. So I hope you see that there was a lot going on politically that probably prevented Edward Buncombe from even thinking about being married again. And so the Boston Tea Party, the people who dressed up as Indians and went to Boston Harbor and dumped 342 casks of tea into the harbor, that was a costly insult to the British. And so they passed 5 laws in 1774. And the first was the Boston Port Act. The others were all consequential, but for our purposes, the Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston, and it was designed to help starve the people out and also destroy their economy. So that affront really affected people in the rest of the colonies. In fact, North Carolina sent at least 2 shiploads of goods to the aid of their friends in Boston. Colonists saw they needed to connect. And so although the committees of correspondence and even the committees of safety had been kind of in the mix for a while, these things grew even more. People knew they did have to unite or die. I want to introduce you to John Harvey. John Harvey lived at Harvey's Point in Perquimans County. Do you all know anything about Harvey's Point or where it's located? Are you familiar? Okay, great. That was Harvey Land. And he became a Speaker of the North Carolina Assembly in the mid-1760s. He was an astute man. He engaged with the British while all these taxes were being imposed and people were rioting. He was quite skilled, quite visionary, and he played an important role as a highly respected Speaker of the Assembly. He was apparently one more connection to Edward Buncombe. What happened after after December 1773, the Virginia colony sent out a circular through their Committee of Correspondence. This was useful. And they said to all the other colonies, we are inviting you to elect representatives to a proposed Continental Congress to be held in Philadelphia in September 1774. So again, you have listening knowledge about the Continental Congress. Well, as Speaker of the Assembly, John Harvey knew that when they met at the next Assembly meeting in New Bern at Tryon Palace, that's when he would handle that business and see what it was the people of the colony the representatives wanted to do. Well, guess what the governor did? Nothing. The governor was a royal governor, Josiah Martin. He did not want North Carolina to be part of those discussions in Philadelphia. He wanted them to be out of it. So he was the only one who had the right, as the king's advocate, to call the assembly to meet or not. So he decided he wasn't calling it. Well, John Harvey got on his horse. Think about that. Roads were crude, distances had to be covered in this way. Maybe some of them had carriages, whatever, but so far as we know, he got on his horse from Buncombe County. He rode down to New Bern. He confirmed what he had heard. The governor was not calling the assembly to meet. And then he took a side trip to Halifax to another like-minded patriot's home. And where did he go next? He got on his horse one more time and he went to Buncombe Hall. So again, we're seeing Buncombe's connections to some of the people who were the leaders in the area. So far as I can tell, Buncombe was a guy who was really enthused and supportive of things, but he was not a politician. So you're not going to find him in records except in an obscure record like this, because who was there at Buncombe Hall waiting with Edward Buncombe when John Harvey arrived? Samuel Johnston, the lawyer. And so the three men spoke long into the night, and the next day Johnston wrote a letter to another patriot and talked about how Harvey was in a horrible mood. And imagine, I didn't say much about Buncombe Hall, but Buncombe Hall was a hall and parlor plan house, 18 feet by 40 feet wide. The parlor was the family room, the smaller room. The hall was the larger room in which they entertained guests. So that is the room where they met long into the night. And eventually, John Harvey said, if the governor won't call the people to meet, the people will call themselves. And so that's what he did. And as a consequence, he organized something called the North Carolina Provincial Congress. So he was the father of that. There were actually 5 of them that met in the first few years of the war. And he managed to get everybody together at New Bern. Now imagine, remember when he rode his horse there from Buncombe County? North Carolina was big. The people were coming from Salisbury, Hillsborough, the Charlotte area, all across the state. So it was not a small effort for a man who was a representative to the assembly to get there. So he managed to get them there. And they met only 3 days, the 25th through the 27th of 1774. They elected 3 men to attend the Continental Congress. And the Continental Congress, guess when it started? September 5th. So the 3 men had to gather their gear and get on their horses or carriages or whatever they did and ride hard to get to Philadelphia. So they made it, but we were part of the big conversation that was going on at Philadelphia. So John Harvey, at Buncombe Hall, made that decision that had a fateful end with these the provincial congresses, excuse me. We're going to look at 1775 for a quick review. You've already heard that we had the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, right? Okay, that was really about gunpowder and weapons because the British were trying to get it from the place where they had all this gunpowder stored at Concord. Now, the British didn't win, they were sent packing, but gunpowder was a big issue because the British realized the Americans were getting testy, and they were afraid that if they allowed them to continue to have gunpowder, there were going to be problems. They might use it against the British. So that's what that battle was about. Well, once the war started, that shot heard around the world, the Second Continental Congress said, okay, we need an army. And so on June 14th, they established the Continental Line. And on June 15th, they appointed or commissioned George Washington as commander-in-chief of the army. And on June 17th, they had the Battle of Bunker Hill. So this is in the colonies. But let's look at what was happening here, because we tend to think all of the action happened up there. We were very inconsequential down here. Nothing quite mattered, but I hope I will change your opinion a little bit about that. Guess what happened to John Harvey? The poor man died on May the 5th. The Battle of Lexington, by the time the news got here by express rider, it was somewhere about the 4th or 5th of May. It took that long for somebody on horseback to get here to say, the war has begun, we've had that battle. But he fell from his horse or was thrown from his horse. It took a few days for him to find out he wasn't going to survive, and he died. And so the man who had shaped the North Carolina colony to ready the people for the coming war, never lived to see it. On September 9th, Edward Buncombe was named colonel or appointed colonel of the Tyrrell militia again. We know why this was again. It wasn't the Regulator War. It was the troubles coming because of the beginning of the war. Some interesting other things happened. And I don't know if we have enough men in here to know if anybody is a Mason, but on November the 8th, Unanimity Lodge number 7 in Edenton was established. I suspect that was a strategic move. Why all of a sudden did they need it? I think we're going to find out. Meanwhile, in April, we talked about royal governors. Well, the royal governor of Virginia was kept at the governor's palace in Williamsburg. And about 2 days after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which he couldn't have known the battle was fought then, guess what he did? He had his sailors confiscate the powder in the magazine at Williamsburg. Well, he created a whole nest of trouble, and by June, he had to vacate Williamsburg because there was so much unrest. But the upshot of that is, by November 15th, there's a battle at Kempsville, or I call it Kempsville, but it was Kemp's Landing. Are you all familiar with Virginia? You know where Great Bridge is, you know where Kempsville is today. If we think about it, all the counties along the state line, Currituck, Camden wasn't established till 1777, Pasquotank, Dare wasn't established till the 19th century. Those people who lived up there were on the front line of trouble. And so we see some of those men from the militia there going to fight in those battles. The December 9th Battle of Great Bridge, the Currituck militia was definitely involved. And so those kinds of troubles were permeating throughout the Albemarle region. People were worried what was going to happen. And so we see 1775 was a year that it wasn't just about Massachusetts. It was about trouble here with other royal governors. 1776, there were a few things that happened. The Fourth Provincial Congress met at Halifax, and on April 12th, they passed the Halifax Resolves. Do you know what those were? They authorized their representatives at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to vote in favor of independence if the question came up. And it did, we know it did, but they were anticipating that. So the Halifax Resolve authorized them to vote for it. And then on April the 15th, Edward Buncombe was appointed colonel of the 5th North Carolina Regiment. Well, in September, just before that, the Provincial Congress had begun appointing colonels to lead some of the early regiments, I think the 1st and 2nd. Now they were expanding it. They needed more men to fight in the Continental Line. And so this was Buncombe's new appointment. He's going to be colonel of the 5th North Carolina Regiment, and he was going to be part of the Continental Line. But he did something else interesting. Do you see Unanimity Lodge up there again? What does he do? Soon after he is appointed colonel, he writes a letter to the lodge asking to be allowed to join. I think that's maybe the protocol. And they said yes. And so the first week of May, he began studying to become a master mason. By the first week in June, he had completed everything. And so why would a man decide all of a sudden, I'm going to war? Oh, let me stop and become a master mason first, please. We do know that a lot of officers all over the colonies were masons, and I'm not privy to all the secrets of masonry, but I do think that there were some good reasons that they knew they needed to be connected. The last thing he did is he had, well, I don't know if it's the last thing, I don't know the order of it, but he had 3 children, didn't he? What was he going to do with 3 children? So he sent his oldest daughter, Elizabeth, north to the home of Abraham Lot, who had been the treasurer of the colony of New York. But that was before the war. Now that the war was over, Abraham Lot was living in Bergen County, New Jersey. And he apparently was wealthy enough. And how else would you decide to choose to send your child to somebody's house unless you knew him well? And so that's where he sent Elizabeth. Then he had his two younger children. He put them in the care of Cullen and Ann Booth Pollock. So we already met them because they were friends of the Buncombes when Elizabeth was still alive. So he had that taken care of, and he was ready to move on. We don't see Buncombe mentioned in this in the March of the North Carolina Brigade because very few people are mentioned. But we know this, that they were marshaled at Wilmington in September. So after Buncombe took care of everything, he went to Wilmington and they headed south because General Washington would get information about what was happening. And he had information that said the British were going to come up through Spanish Florida and march through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and keep on marching and take over the colonies. So he said to them somewhere when they were en route, okay, you need to go to Charleston. But before they got there, they sent another express rider and said, nope, never mind. They're not coming that way. But you need to return and come north to where Washington was, up in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. And so you see the mention of these places, and you see the red line that shows you the route. It's roughly 1,100 miles that they marched before they got back north. Now, I can tell you, Colonel Buncombe and all the other officers rode horses. The men marched. They didn't have horses for everybody. They couldn't possibly. So that was a very long march, but they were then positioned to be joining General Washington. I will say this about the Halifax to Alexandria. They stopped there for a particular reason. They had to be, they called it variolated, but it was really inoculated for smallpox. Washington had already lost some men to smallpox, but what they knew was if you got variolated, which is basically what we know, they scraped out material from a pustule on somebody who had it, and they made an incision and put it in another person's arm. And the case that that person got was they got sick, but the likelihood of death was much reduced. So that's what they did in Alexandria. They were variolated there, and then they marched on, and they by July, they were close to Philadelphia. But Colonel Buncombe, remember the hospitable, gracious, genteel, educated man, made a stop. Before he kept on going with everybody, he made a turn and came back to the Albemarle region. Probably saw his children too, but he went to Unanimity Lodge number 7 and he presented them with a pair of engraved silver candlesticks. Bill and I had the privilege of visiting that lodge about 15 years ago. They were on display there on a landing on the way to the second flight of stairs to the second floor. And so, again, I think that speaks of his graciousness. Again, we don't know a lot of other things about him, but we know he's willing to fight, he's very loyal, and he's very gracious and hospitable. And so that's his last stop home before he heads to Philadelphia. We call it today the Philadelphia Campaign, but guess what it was to George Washington? You know, when he thought they were going to march up through Spanish Florida, he found out instead they were in the Chesapeake Bay. And where were they going? They thought they were going to Philadelphia. Was that strategic? Yeah, that's where the Continental Congress met. And all of those people were considered to be traitors, and any of them could have been hung at the time. So that was what George Washington was trying to stop. He wanted to stop them from taking Philadelphia in the September-October battles that followed. The first battle was Brandywine. Again, there's no mention of Buncombe. Do we know the North Carolina Brigade was there? Yes. Do we know that that was his first taste of battle? Yes. After that, on September 20th, some British massacred 53 Americans outside of a tavern called Paoli. And on September 26th, they captured Philadelphia. And so George Washington had to decide what to do next. He's going to Germantown. Bill's going to tell you about that.
Let me see if I can get all my stuff straight here. Here we go. An excellent resource if you're interested in the Battle of Germantown is The Surprise of Germantown by Thomas McGuire. Excellent book. And it was aptly titled because that's exactly what it was. General Washington saw that he had one last chance after his loss at Brandywine to try and oust the British from Philadelphia. His plan was a surprise attack, and it had only been like 3 weeks since the Battle of Brandywine, and it was just unheard of that a defeated army would turn around and make an attack again. But that was his strategy. That was his plan. Most of that time in October, most armies were thinking about going into winter quarters where they would just survive the winter, then come back out in the spring to fight again. But Washington decided that he was going to have a surprise attack at Germantown. His target, Germantown, was just a small village on the outskirts of Philadelphia. There were about 9,000 British troops encamped in Germantown. Washington had about 11,000 men under his command. He divided his men into 4 separate columns, and they were to approach the Germantown from 4 different directions. His whole idea was here was going to be surprise, and so he kept everything a secret. They didn't leave or march away from where they were at on the evening of October 3rd till about 6 o'clock at night. They marched all night long. The troops marched 14 miles, some marched 20 miles. So it was an all-night march to get to Germantown in order to surprise the British Army. The plan was for the columns to attack at about 5 a.m., but there had been a heavy fog that night, and the roads were difficult to follow and the paths, and of course, no one had cell phones or radios or any way to communicate, so you didn't know where the other columns were. But at 5 o'clock, they decided that they were going to make an advance toward the British lines. And they approached the lines with fixed bayonets. The idea was we're going to subdue the pickets and charge the British while they were still sleeping in their tents. Well, you have to give the British, I guess, their due. The sentries were doing their duty. They discovered the American advance. They fired the warning shots, and the British Army was alarmed and awake and on their feet. But the attack was a complete surprise. And at the same time, in this pre-dawn darkness and all this fog, and with the sounds of gunfire coming from different spots, because some of the columns had arrived on time, and the battle plan was going close to what the plan was. The British couldn't determine what was going on. They didn't know where the Americans were. They didn't know which way they were coming in. So it threw them into chaos, and they retreated. Captain von Munchausen, he was an aide to the British General Howe, recorded in his diary that he said, to see something I had never seen before, namely the British in full flight. So the whole British Army was pulling back toward Philadelphia. As the Americans swept through Germantown, following the retreating British, they encountered the 4th Regiment of Foot under Colonel Musgrave. They had encamped on the grounds of this building that was called Cliveden. It was also referred to as the Chew House. And so before they could get up and going, so to speak, the Americans were upon them, and they were fighting there on the ground. So they saw only one way that they could survive was to retreat into the house. So they retreated. About 100 to 140 British soldiers retreated into the house. Musgrave ordered his men to secure the shutters, barricade the doors, pull the furniture up, turn it into a fortress, and he told his men that they would receive no quarter, that if they surrendered, the Americans were going to put them to death. And so they were motivated to hold their position. Some men were posted in the basement. There were soldiers on each level. There were men in the attic. They even had soldiers on the roof. And they might have actually gone through basically unscathed, because when they went into the building, most of the front line of the American troops was swept by them. But as more American reinforcements came up to the front line, the British started sniping at them from the building. And that raised their attention to think, well, there's a problem here. There's British soldiers in this building. We've got to do something about it. They had two options. General Washington convened his staff and said, what are we going to do about this? We can either post a guard around the house, around the grounds to make sure they stay in the building, they don't come out, or we try to eliminate the threat. And in that period of time, one of the tenets of warfare was that you never leave a fortified enemy position to your rear. And so the staff decided we have to eliminate the threat. So they had a plan. They were going to reduce the building with cannon fire. Second, that didn't work. They were going to capture it with a force of arms, which would mean an advance toward the house. And if that didn't work, they were going to burn it down. But two significant events happened prior to the assault on Clifton. The North Carolina Brigade was coming up, and they were going to take a major role in the assault on Clifton. Their leader, Brigadier General Francis Nash, was leading the troops and had stopped and turned. He was on horseback to talk to a major that he was giving orders to. A high arching cannonball came from one of the British cannons, hit Nash's horse in the neck, went through the neck, through Nash's thigh, and into the head of Major Thomas Witherspoon, who was killed instantly. The horse collapsed. Nash was under the horse. North Carolina troops came, tried to lift the horse, trying to pull him out. His leg was pretty much almost severed, and he would die 3 days later from his wounds. The second thing that happened that really got the ire up with the American troops was they decided, well, before we assault this thing, let's give the British troops a chance to surrender. We'll just take them prisoners. So Lieutenant Colonel William Smith of Virginia volunteered to approach the house and see about terms of surrender, along with a drummer who was beating parley, which that's what you did in those days. They had a certain rhythm they beat on the drum, which meant you wanted to parley, you wanted to talk. They entered the grounds of Clifton to see about surrender. Smith was shot dead. And they don't know whether it was because of the fog or the smoke or the battle or whether they didn't see or didn't hear. But anyway, he was killed, which was considered a very, not a very good thing to do. The man was coming there basically under a flag of truce, and you shot him down. So this really got the Americans, kind of got their blood up, I guess you could say, to what the men there inside Clifton. So they started the cannonade. The New Jersey troops had some cannons. They set them up. They fired against the structure many, many times. But what they found, that what they were doing was basically to no avail. The walls were 18 inches thick of limestone. They were shooting solid shot in those days, not explosive cannonballs. They could not penetrate the walls. Cannonballs went through the windows. Cannonballs went through the front door and out the back door. They shot the doors off the house. They busted out most of the windows, but they could not bring the house down with cannon fire. So the North Carolina troops were assembled, even though the brigadier general had been mortally wounded. They prepared their attack. They assaulted the house, but they were repelled. They were not able to gain entry to the house. This is a painting by Howard Pyle that kind of gives you an idea of what that assault might have looked like. Finally, some troops in this, so they decided, well, the next thing to do was, the third part was, well, we're going to burn it down. So some troops pushed carts of straw up to the house, and they tried to stuff the straw through the basement windows where they could start a fire. The British shot them down, or they bayoneted them through the windows as they tried to push the straw in. So they were not able to do that. During the assault on the Chew House, the American troops continued their advance against the British, but the tide of battle was about to turn. British troops had pretty much halted their retreat. Fresh troops from Philadelphia were on the way, and a counterattack was certainly about to happen. Now, you got to remember, the American forces had been marching all night. They'd been marching since 5 o'clock, all night march. They had 40 rounds of ammunition was all they were given to go into battle. Because it was happening on so many different fronts with the 4 different columns, and because of the smoke and the fog, they weren't really able to be resupplied. So they basically were running out of ammunition. And they had a very serious event where the two columns collided, and in the smoke of the battle, they thought it was the British and they fired on each other. So we lost the men due to friendly fire. Well, all this confusion and the lack of ammunition and the uncertainty of where the British were, and they were all kind of tangled up, the Americans decided the best thing to do was withdraw. And that's what they did. The battle was over by 8 o'clock, and the American forces retreated. As the Americans withdrew, they left many of their dead and seriously wounded on the field. Clifton, although it was still standing, was pretty much a wreck. Cannonballs, grape shot, musket balls had scarred the interior. Walls and ceilings were pockmarked with splattered blood and holes from gunfire. Both the front and the back doors were gone. They had piled up furniture to keep any Americans from coming through the front or the back door. Most of that had been shot, riddled with musket fire. Most of the inside of the house was a complete loss. The British suffered about 30 casualties in defense of Clifton inside the house. After the battle, after the Americans withdrew and the British came up, on the grounds there were about 75 American dead, including 7 officers. Of those officers, 2 were from the 5th North Carolina. Colonel Edward Buncombe and his subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Irwin. But Colonel Buncombe was not dead. He had been left as dead, but he was seriously wounded. And the story is that an old schoolmate of his, a British officer who he had gone to school with, recognized him laying on the grounds of Clifton and discovered that he was not dead, that he was alive. So he was taken as a prisoner of war. These were the casualties from the battle. It's kind of a testament to the severity of the fighting. Of the 150 killed, 75 of those, half of them were on the grounds of Clifton. So that's how intense the fighting was there at Clifton. Henry Irwin of Tarboro was killed. He was a lieutenant colonel. And for some reason, we've been to this place called the Upper Burying Ground, and it's just 100 yards from Clifton. It's just right down the street from it. After the battle, most of the men were buried in mass graves, pretty much where they laid. They gathered them up. All the yards and gardens of the houses in Germantown ended up with graves in them where they would bury the soldiers. But for some reason, some soldiers were taken here to the Upper Burying Ground, which was a cemetery. And I don't know why these North Carolina troops were, but they were. And this is a SAR memorial to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Irwin on his death on the Clifton assault. And if you go in the very back of the cemetery, you'll see this gravestone right here. See some American flags here? You'll see this gravestone here. And on that gravestone is written, "Honor to the brave." And the Latin phrase means, "Here lies in peace." And they say Major Irvin, but it's really Lieutenant Colonel Irwin. And 6 soldiers, Americans, killed in the Battle of Germantown. And the phrase is, "One cause, one grave." And if we went back, we were curious about these 6 Americans. We went back and looked at the muster records from the 5th North Carolina. And these 6 men were listed as killed in action on October the 4th. So I feel very confident that these 6 men are the 6 men that are interned in that grave with Henry Irwin. So some sources indicate that officers who were prisoners of war were taken to the 2nd floor of the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall. So Colonel Buncombe was probably taken there. and given some basic medical treatment. Regular soldiers, enlisted men that were captured were housed in terrible conditions. They were in jails or they were out in the elements. They were really treated horribly. The British were not going to waste food or medical care on the rebels. During his recovery, Buncombe was allowed parole to the city, and he took a room at the Widow Kendall's boarding house. Now, parole was something that was usually offered to officers. And what it meant was it was a gentlemanly code, was that you agreed that you would remain in the city. You had to check in at regular times with a British officer to verify that you were still there. And you agreed not, while you were in the city, you agreed not to bear arms against the British or speak of the war in any way to incite any kind of sympathy toward the cause. But while you were on parole, you had to pay for your room and board, and you had to pay for any of your medical expenses. This AI image that Chris was able to pull up gives you some idea of what the row houses in Philadelphia looked like during that period of time. And we feel like they were narrow and deep, and it's likely that the Widow Kendall's house looked something like this. Charles was accompanied by an enslaved man that served pretty much as his servant and his aide. And it was quite common during the Revolutionary War for officers to bring a servant or someone to help mend their uniform and set up their camp and all that kind of stuff. We know about Charles because of a few letters that were written after Buncombe's death inquiring about Charles, his whereabouts, and if he had survived the battle. Charles would have been just one more nameless and nearly forgotten enslaved person, was it not for those letters. Many other personal servants remain anonymous and are unknown because there is no record of their being serving there. While Buncombe was on parole, Charles, of course, would not have been allowed to stay in the boarding house, so he stayed somewhere nearby and assisted Colonel Buncombe as much as he could. This is a letter that Colonel Buncombe wrote to General Washington after the battle and during his recovery. And in this letter, he says a couple of things. He's requesting an exchange. And he says, have I not been anxious to fight for America? And then further down in the letter, he reveals his station in life when he says he was not accustomed to adversity. So living in this boarding house was kind of below his means or below the way he was brought up. So he's asking for some help from Washington in order to return him back to the Continental Line. But George Washington had other priorities at that time. Following Germantown, the troops went into winter quarters at Yorktown. He was faced with a starving army. He had a brutal winter, had disease. They had to reorganize the army. So there was not much he could do for Colonel Buncombe. Following the war, General Washington sent this letter back to Buncombe's family so they could have it as part of their personal records. But Buncombe requested a prisoner exchange, but really at that point in the war, Britain had no interest in exchanging for any prisoners. In May 1778, remember the battle was in October 1777, Colonel Buncombe was still recovering from his wounds. The story is that he fell down a flight of stairs in the Widow Kendall's boarding house, reopening his wounds, and he bled to death. Colonel Buncombe was buried on May 17, 1778, at Christ Church Cemetery at the corner of 5th Street and Arch Street in Philadelphia. And in the same cemetery is buried Joseph Hughes of Edenton, who was a representative to the Continental Congress, and also Benjamin Franklin's buried there. To settle his debts, which he had incurred while he was on parole, they had to sell all of his effects, uniform, sword, whatever he might have had, personal papers, Everything was sold pretty much at public auction in order to pay his debts. It was noted that Charles had made it clear that he wanted Charles, his enslaved servant that was with him, to be freed. A letter was written to that effect, and it appears his valet was freed and possibly continued to serve with the army during the remainder of the war as a messenger. Two men from Buncombe Hall, Edward and Charles, went off to war, but neither man returned to Tyrrell County. At Philadelphia, Buncombe ended his 10 years in America, and Charles set out on a new life. To honor Edward Buncombe, there's a state historic marker in Roper. There is also a marker at St. Luke's Church, which had been built on Buncombe land. And in 1791, in the western part of the state, Buncombe County was named, and Buncombe County is where Asheville is located today. So Buncombe County in the western part of the state was named because of the hero Colonel Edward Buncombe. Chris has a couple announcements she wants to make about the 250th event, and then we'll take whatever questions you might have.
Thank you, Bill. We have 3 events in Washington County, and I want to make you aware that on April 25th, we're going to commemorate Daniel Davenport, a 16-year-old boy who served in the 5th for only 6 months. So you can mark that if you're interested. June 6th, as 2026, we have the Revolutionary War themed National Black Bear Festival in Plymouth. It's going to be a really exciting time with reenactors, special fireworks. And on September 12th, we are planning to dedicate a wayside marker to honor Colonel Buncombe and Charles. Any questions? Yes.
I was curious about the letter to General Washington. Was this a violation of his parole? I didn't see any redactions as though it were smuggled out, or was it commonplace to allow correspondence with the enemy while you were a captive of?
I'm not sure. It could have been smuggled out, but as long as the impression I had was as long as you weren't inciting sympathy for the rebels, you were okay. You couldn't go around. You couldn't be in the tavern condemning the British and saying, "Boy, we're gonna beat them" and all that kind of. You'd have gone to jail. So his personal correspondence, I don't know if that was subject to those kind of parole or not. I'm not sure.
And the letter's undated, so that doesn't help either. That there's no date on it. But again, it was given to the family. There are some records that the family has at Wilson Library at Chapel Hill. That's where they're housed now. And so we do know that apparently it was a legitimate letter that he wrote. But some of the circumstances, we just don't know how they did that.
So what happened to the children? You said family. What happened with the children? Because evidently we never saw them again.
Yeah, no, they were orphans completely. We know that Elizabeth, the oldest child, stayed with Abraham Lot and married while she was up there. So she never really came back permanently until about 1791. And as the only son, Thomas, was the one who was going to inherit all the property. And the sisters, the daughters, were going to get a little bit of money and some other personal effects, but they would not get the property unless their brother died. So what happened is about 1790-91, Thomas did die. He was maybe 22, something like that. And so then the 2 girls inherited the property and it was divided. So Elizabeth and her husband, John Golette, left New Jersey and came home, and they got a smaller amount of acreage, but they inherited Buncombe Hall. And so her sister Hester and her brother, her husband John Clark of Bertie County, remember Hester remained in this area, so she married a local man. They got considerably more acreage, but they did not get any of the tenements or the buildings or anything like that. And the descendants lived in the house until the 1850s. And by then, they had had a depression and all kinds of other difficulties. And the building went up to a courthouse sale several times in the 1850s. Most of the descendants of Buncombe moved to Demopolis, Alabama, except for Hester's children descended from Bertie County. So they left, and then finally, after the Civil War, one more time, Buncombe Hall went under the auction block gavel, and it was sold to a man from Connecticut said to be a carpetbagger. He bought it. By then, the leaky house was in such poor condition. He didn't live there. He lived in a side building that had been really a school, probably for Edward Buncombe's grandchildren who lived there. So he dismantled it. He sold it for parts. Think of it as the Lowe's of the day. You know, where did you get building supplies? Well, you need a window. There's windows here, door frames and things like that. And my suspicion, I cannot guarantee it, is that probably after the Civil War, only 10% of Plymouth, nearby 9 miles away, was left. And I tend to think that probably there are parts of Buncombe Hall here and there in Washington County, somewhere between Roper and Plymouth.
They mentioned where they were buried, the daughters.
Oh, and by the way, the cemetery that he mentioned about St. Luke's Episcopal Church Cemetery, the church was taken down about, I think it says 1918. It had been built in 1836. Well, when Colonel Buncombe's daughter Elizabeth died, they buried her somewhere on Buncombe property near the house. But afterwards, they moved her remains to this cemetery. So she, one of her sons who stayed there to maintain the plantation, and her husband are all three buried at that cemetery. And so I believe Hester, the other daughter, is buried at St. Paul's in Edenton. And I'm not sure where Thomas is buried, but they're still amongst us, so to speak. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was an accident.
He was a neighbor of ours.
You know, we live in Washington County, and when we discovered that this man existed, we had already begun reading about the American Revolution and the readers. And we discovered him, and it was like, he only lived about 7 miles from us as the crow flies. And so that was just a cause to get interested. So we've done a lot of things. We went to St. Kitts to check out the archives at St. Kitts to find out what we could find. And it was a wonderful trip. We did find a single Buncombe grave at the churchyard where he had been baptized, but it was so illegible we couldn't make it out. But we had a great time touring the area. We went to see several sugar mills. So we did that. We also went to England to see where the Buncombes had come from in Somerset, because Buncombe's great-great-grandfather was a man named Sir Amias Paulette. That was intriguing to me. And he was appointed by Queen Elizabeth I to be the last jailer of Mary Queen of Scots. You know, Mary Queen of Scots, who was eventually, so Sir Amias Paulette was the last jailer. So in looking through his genealogy, we did go to the village. We went to the church where the family once worshiped. Again, they were wealthy then, because in this church, there were 2 transepts on the sides of the building on either side of the main altar area. One of them was the Paulette transept. So they did not have to worship in a main part of the church with everybody else, with the commoners. They worshiped from there. But anyhow, one of the Paulette descendants married a Buncombe, John Buncombe, And that's how the Paulettes came to be, the Buncombe's came to be at Go First in Somerset. So I think we're just curious people. Your question was, and we love history, and we're just curious. And I fortunately retired in 2006. He didn't retire for a few more years, but I like to get to know more. You sometimes like to do that and find out, that man lived near us, he was, I think a lot of the things we did, I said, because of Edward Buncombe, we did this. And then because of Edward Buncombe, we did that. And that's the truth. Because of him, we were curious to find out more. So, yeah, we can't help ourselves. And we didn't know when we married, it'll be 54 years on the 11th, that we were both going to want to do this. But we did.
Very good storytellers.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. I think